It's very difficult in a talk like this to do full justice to the extraordinary achievements of this foremost lay meditation teacher, Goenkaji's own teacher, Sayagyi U Ba Khin. He not only achieved extraordinary results in short periods with his students, but he combined this with a stellar career as a civil servant, a senior civil servant in Burma, post-war Burma, holding at different times, sometimes simultaneously, 6 or 7 different very senior government posts, even at cabinet level. And we'll see how during his life these dual roles played out, became intertwined, and in some ways supported each other. And of course, he was Goenkaji's own teacher. He was born in 1899 in Rangoon, the son of a broker. It was a poor family. He had up to the age of 8, a very traditional education from the local monks. And then, luckily for him, an elderly man from a neighboring factory enabled him to go to the Methodist college nearby, which was an English medium college. And that was important for his subsequent career. The British at that time ruled Burma. It was part of the British Empire, actually part of India as far as the British were concerned. And if you wanted to get on in the civil service or advance your career in any way, you needed to speak English. And so here was Sayagyi in an English-speaking school, and he was a very bright student. He regularly came top of all his classes, and he was given a grammar book, being taught his grammar, and he was able to memorize the entire grammar book page by page. So he continued like that all the way through Methodist College. And then again, of course, he got noticed by a Burmese teacher who enabled him to go to St. Paul's, quite a prestigious college. And again, he came top in every class, matriculated with his high school exams, got a gold medal, and the obvious thing then would have been university. But by that time, his mother had died, his father was very sick. There was no question of any funds for him to go to university. Soon after that, his father did die, and he was on his own, so he had to make his own way. He started off by joining the Sun newspaper. This was a new Burmese language nationalist newspaper. He spent a little while on that. And then, as we all know, he joined the Accountant General's office as a junior clerk. Now, there were a number of offices, including the Accountant General's office, in this administration, which were known as Indian offices. In other words, they were totally dominated by the Indians. The Burmese didn't really get a look in. They were underdogs, basically. In that office, there were only 3 Burmese working, and it was not easy for the Burmese. The government tried to change the situation. They recruited 6 well-educated young Burmese men into the Accountant General's office. One of them was Sayagyi, and Sayagyi was the only one who survived, who didn't resign or leave the office. So he continued. Again, because of his extraordinary memory, concentration, he was able to pass his accounting exams in 1926, so now he was a qualified accountant. And again, he could memorize all his accounting books page by page. So that was Sayagyi. He continued like that. He got another promotion to junior superintendent of the office. At this stage, he had shown very little interest in meditation. He was just making his way in the world, doing what he could, earning a crust. And then all that changed. On January the 1st, 1937, he came across a student of Sayatet's. And that student taught him Anapana, just the very basics. So Sayagyi went home and he just started practicing Anapana just at home, and discovered very quickly his concentration was so good that he could play with mental light in any way he liked, while he was meditating. Now, how many of us can do that? And he hasn't even taken a course yet. So within a week, he felt, I have to go. I have to go to Sayagyi and take a proper course. And we know the story very well. He asked for permission from his superiors. It was denied. He went anyway. And at that time, this was the 8th of January now, just a week after his first attempt at Samadhi, he headed off, Sayagyi's place is about 8 miles south of Rangoon, across the river, the Rangoon River. It doesn't sound far, but it was low tide, post-harvest, muddy fields, and the Sampani herd could only get about halfway up the tributaries. So he had to get out, his knees sinking into the mud, right up to his knees, carrying his bedroll and a few provisions, and he made the remaining few miles on foot, his legs caked in mud. He arrived, and along with another student was given Anapana that night by Sayagyi, and such was his concentration that he was given Vipassana the very next day. He stayed for 7 days and achieved, as Goenka put it, giddy heights. Sayagyi was very impressed. When he came home, he thought he'd get the dismissal letter, found the envelope. As we know, he was promoted to chief superintendent. The background is that the British at that time had decided to separate the India and the Burma offices. India and Burma were becoming separate provinces, so they wanted a Burmese person as their superintendent, and Sayagyi was really the only candidate. So now he's superintendent of the office, his salary goes 50% higher, as we know, and he gets promotion after promotion. And he was held up as an example of how a Burmese person really can progress even in an Indian-dominated office. But by this time, it was becoming more Burmese. Now, his next major promotion was he became chief accountant of the Burma Railways Board. And this was quite a grand position now. He was responsible for auditing all the accounts of the Burma Railways, and he had a special carriage which he'd attached to the trains. And in his carriage, which was his own carriage, his office would be there, his sleeping quarters, everything. He could go up and down the line and just detach himself at any station he liked, audit their accounts, and then reattach to the next train he fancied. So he was doing that, and then a happenstance occurred. His carriage was detached at a place called Chowsi. It's spelt Corksey, it's pronounced Chowsi. This was in 1941, and it was an error. The Chowsi station had already actually been audited by someone else. But now he had 2 or 3 days doing nothing. So he audited the accounts anyway, took a walk with the deputy station master, a rather nice hill opposite, pleasant walk, and he noticed below a series of bamboo huts below the hill opposite. And he was curious. He said, "What's that?" And the deputy station master said, "Oh, well, that's Webu Hill, and below it is a very, very developed monk called Webu Sayadaw. People have extremely high regard for him." And Sayagyi, of course, was very interested, wanted to go and pay respects, meet this monk. And the deputy station master said, "Oh, no, 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 you can't go now. Go in the afternoon. He won't see anybody now." So Sayagyi went back to his carriage, had his lunch, practiced meditation, sent metta, and mentally requested this monk at the bottom of the hill, "Please receive me." And then he set off for the station master. They arrived about 3 p.m. in the afternoon at this little collection of bamboo huts, found an old nun pounding chilies, and she said, "Oh, no, 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 there's no point in coming here now. He won't come out till 6. He never receives visitors. He certainly doesn't entertain people. If you're lucky, you might get a discourse at 6. And Sayagyi said, "Well, look, we've come all the way from Rangoon. May we please at least go and pay respects outside his bamboo hut?" This is the bamboo hut. And so he did, knelt down, paid respects, and said, "Please, sir, we've come all the way from Rangoon. Please open the door for us." And to everyone's astonishment, the door opened. Out came Webu Sayadaw, preceded by a cloud of mosquitoes. And Webu Sayadaw looks at him and says, "What's your aspiration?" "To gain Nibbana, sir." "Oh, and how are you going to do that?" "By practicing Vipassana, sir, by being with anicca." And Webu says, "Sadhu, sadhu," because Sayagyi says, "I'm practicing anicca in my body, Vipassana, right now, even while I'm talking to you." And then Webu cross-questions him. "Where did you learn this Vipassana?" And he talks about Sayagyi, whose student he is, of course, still, and talks about his experiences in meditation. Webu Sayadaw is incredibly impressed. He said, "I've been meditating for years in the forest to gain the attainments that you're talking about, that you've attained." Long conversation, and normally Webu Sayadaw didn't talk to anybody, or if he did, it was for very short periods. Long conversation. At the end of it, Sayagyi asked permission, "Can I come back the next day and provide you with your breakfast, sir?" "Yes, of course you can." So off he went, back home, back to his carriage. Came again the next day. Again, long talks. At the end of it, Webu Sayadaw says this: "You have paramis. You must spread the sasana. And you must do so now. Don't delay, because if you delay, the people who might have got it will miss it. Start teaching now." Now that's a pretty strong injunction from a very, very senior monk. With that ringing in his ears, Sayagyi goes back to his carriage and starts teaching. His first pupil is the deputy station master, sitting in the carriage, and he teaches him Anapana. Now, after that, this was 1941, he still didn't start teaching in any systematic way for some time. But then the war came. The Japanese invaded, and the British fled north, helter-skelter up north from Mandalay. The Japanese were in Rangoon, they'd taken Rangoon, they started bombing Mandalay. And now a wonderful example of Sayagyi's Shila. The Japanese left the railway station in ruins. But in the ruins, Sayagyi knew there was the safe where they kept the money, the Burma Railways Board, and all their operating cash money was in that safe. He had the key. So he goes through the ruins, finds the safe, the key still works, he opens it, gets out a very substantial sum of money, and now what's he going to do with this money? The British have fled, the Japanese are on the way, it's no man's land, there's no government of any kind. He could very easily have pocketed the money, and at that time he was pretty stretched financially because his daughter was sick, needing a lot of medical care, but not Sayagyi. He thinks about it and decides, well, this money belongs to the British. Even though they've fled, I must try and get it back to them. So he hires a jeep, drives 3 hours north to Maimyo, where the British still are in flight, finds his superior officer, hands over the money to the astonished officer, and then says, "And now, sir, may I please have my monthly salary and my travel expenses?" That was Sayagyi. So the war continued, and Sayagyi was living in Rangoon, doing his accounting work, and he was holding group sittings at his house. Today we'd call him a group sitting contact. People used to come, and Sayagyi used to come as well from time to time, give instructions. This was during the war years. And the other students would say to Sayagyi, "Oh, look, please come more often. You know, it'd be really great to have you here." And Sayagyi is actually encouraging Sayagyi to teach now. And he says, "Well, I'm like the doctor. You can see me sometimes. But U Ba Khin is like the nurse. He's always here. Talk to him." The war years finish. In 1948, Burma gains independence. And this brings Sayagyi into contact with U Nu, who was the prime minister by then. And this was a very close relationship between two men who enormously respected each other. U Nu himself was actually a very good developed meditator. He wrote an essay or a little treatise, a booklet on meditation, which you can still get. It's rather sweetly entitled by U Mong Nyu, the former Prime Minister of Burma. And he writes, if you haven't attained the paths and the fruits, don't read this book. It'll just put you off. So that was U Nu, a good meditator and the Prime Minister. And this long relationship continued, but initially the situation in Burma of the government was dire. When the Japanese had come earlier, they had armed the young Burmese with weapons so that they could fight the British. And when the British came, they armed the young Burmese so they could fight the Japanese. So the whole country was awash with arms and ammunition. And then all these insurgent movements started. There were the communists, there were the socialists, the Karens in the north, other secessionist movements. And it got so bad that the government by then controlled very little of the country, maybe only 10% of the country. All the rest was in rebel-held hands. Trains going up and down the line were preceded by an armoured guard, an armoured car. Every city had a curfew at night, closed the gates and put on guards. And even by then, there was a rebel camp 10 miles from Rangoon, threatening Rangoon. It was a really desperate situation. Sayagyi used to go round to U Nu's house sometimes and just give metta. Later on, when U Nu was asked how he survived that period, he said, it was only my meditation which kept me going. And now the army was desperate, the Burmese army, and they needed supplies. And U Nu managed to negotiate supplies from a friendly country, but they didn't have the wherewithal to get them into the country. They needed aeroplanes. So they had to buy aeroplanes. The government made a very hurried decision under enormous pressure because the whole government was hanging by a thread by now. They made a hurried decision to buy the aeroplanes, approve the funds. And then another example of Sayagyi's total Shila and integrity. Despite the situation, he blocks it. He says, no, that's illegal under the constitution, you can't do that. So poor U Nu, he goes round to Sayagyi's place and says, well, look, can you find a way we can do this? And they sit down, they find a way, it's passed, and the supplies come. Gradually, the Burmese army starts winning, starts defeating the secessionist movements, and they gradually start regaining control of the country. Now, another example of Sayagyi's strictness and Shila, he regards his job as making sure that every single penny of government money is properly accounted for. By now, U Nu was able to think about broader things like education, and he decided to have a good higher education program. And so again, he passes an appropriation in Parliament for this. Sayagyi says, no, can't do that. There's no provision under the Constitution to do that. So poor U Nu, what's he do now? He gets together with the local turf club, the horse racing club. And they're mostly rich people, and they decide to have a big horse race in which the entry stakes will be really, really high. Everybody knows what it's for. It's for higher education. The horse race is held, large amount of money is raised, big ceremony, the turf club hands over the check to U Nu. U Nu proudly hands it to his education minister, goes back to the accountant general's office. Sayagyi says, nope, can't do that. Poor U Nu, he goes along, he says, well, what's wrong now? And Sayagyi says, well, this is the profits of the turf club. There has to be a government tax on it before you can do anything with it. So the government tax was taken out and the rest distributed for higher education. So this was Sayagyi. But at the same time, there was enormous respect between them. U Nu was the prime minister who gave him permission to start teaching meditation in his little room in the accountant general's office and actively encouraged him. Very quickly, that room became too small. So just a year later, the accountant general's office formed an association. They found a piece of land and they built a center just within 1 year. And here it is, here's Sayagyi standing in front of his center, By the way, all the quotes you see in all these slides are from Sayagyi himself at different times. Notice also the flowers. Sayagyi loved flowers. He used to collect rare species, took great care with them, loved watering them, looking after them, and would talk at length to visitors about his beautiful flowers. Here's another picture of IMC. As you can see, there's this beautiful pagoda. Above it, with the green roof, is the meditation hall. Above that, the teacher's residence. And then to the right-hand side, you've got some little kutis or huts and an accommodation building. Now, there was one innovation which Sayagyi did. Traditionally, Burmese stupas or pagodas were all solid. And Sayagyi, as far as we know, was the first to make a hollow pagoda in which you could meditate. So he started off having this central room and the 8 cells round, and you can see them in the background there. We now move on to 1953. A year later, the centre's running. It's still pretty difficult in Burma. A lot of civil commotion, a lot of strife, and there was a belief among senior Burmese that if a very developed monk was brought to the capital, gave metta, meditated there, gave Dhamma, things would improve. And Sayagyi had a very strong feeling that this should be Webu Sayadaw. And so he persuaded U. U said, all right, go ahead, invite him. And the two men had not met or even exchanged any correspondence for over 10 years since Webu Sayadaw had authorized Sayagyi as a teacher. No contact. So now Sayagyi sends his secretary, association secretary, up to Mandalay, up to the north, to find Webu Sayadaw and deliver the invitation. He gets there. In the meantime, he meets a friend of his in Mandalay who says, what are you doing here? And he tells him, and the friend says, you haven't got a chance. Webu Sayadaw has 3 monasteries up in the north. He never leaves them. He never accepts any invitations anywhere. And not only that, but it is very unusual for any monk to visit a householder's centre. Nevertheless, the secretary persists. He finds Webu Sayadaw eating his lunch in a leisured way. Webu Sayadaw doesn't seem in the least surprised to see him, waits till lunch is over, and then delivers the invitation. Sir, your paramis are very powerful. Your ability to teach is great, but your students to date are very few. Please come down to southern Burma, spread Dhamma with all your metta and compassion. This is the time. Now is the time. Everybody's sitting round, astonished. Now what's Webu Sayadaw going to do? Remember, he's never accepted any invitation outside. And this is to a householder's centre. So he looks at the secretary and says, well, maybe tomorrow would be a bit early. How about the next day we travel? And you could have knocked everybody over with a feather. So Webu Sayadaw goes down to Sayagyi Centre at IMC with 6 monks. Sayagyi organizes the plane tickets. And Webu hops on a plane as if he'd travelled every day on a plane in his life, gets picked up by Sayagyi by car at the other end, taken to IMC, pays respects, hops out of the car, pays respects to the pagoda, goes up the steps, circumambulates the pagoda 3 times, and this is what he's doing in this photograph here. Sayagyi's leading him, Webu Sayadaw is behind with his personal assistant, walks around 3 times, is shown into the central cell. All Sayagyi's students are sitting around in the outer cells. He's requested to give Dhamma. He gives a Dhamma discourse, meditates with them for some time, and then goes to his quarters and takes rest. The next day, all the leading lights of Burma, of Rangoon, start coming to IMC. Of course, this is hugely prestigious for IMC to have such a venerable, famous monk come there. And you get ministers coming, leading lights of society, throngs of them. And this effectively launched Webu Sayadaw's career as a teacher. And thereafter, he used to go down every year to southern Burma, take a tour. He would almost invariably spend some time at IMC. He'd usually give a discourse and meditate with the students there. And here is a beautiful picture taken sometime during that period of Sayagyi paying respects to Webu Sayadaw. And some years later, he remarked, this is Webu Sayadaw, this place used to be like a jungle. And now look at it, it's just like the time of the Buddha. So many people are getting benefit. And then he goes on, work hard to attain the highest. This is a nucleus, this is the first center of many. Webu Sayadaw could see what was coming. Now that was at IMC, but I mentioned earlier how his two careers were intertwined. He was also very busy on another enormous project. You're very well aware, I'm sure, of this prophecy, this tradition that 2,500 years after the Buddha, the second sasana would start again with Vipassana. And the Burmese were very, very well aware of it. At that time was May 1956, when the 2,500th anniversary would come. And U Nu decided that he would call the Sixth Great Sasana Council. You remember that the first one, held after the death of the Buddha, this was to go through all the scriptures and correct them if any mistakes had come in. The first one was the one where Ananda famously became an arahant just in time, overnight. The second and third were held in India, the third under Ashoka, the fourth in Sri Lanka, the fifth under King Mindon in Burma. That was the one at which Lady Sayadaw famously spoke, if you've heard that. And here's U Nu doing the sixth. Now, a huge project. This was the Great Hall. It was known as the Great Cave, where the scriptures were recited. All the discourses of the Buddha, his instructions to the monks, all that, the Abhidhamma, everything was recited in that hall. It took 2 years, but the preparations were enormous. This hall was built, and not only this hall, but it took 5,000 monks with 10 to 15,000 lay observers. It was regularly too crowded, and the observers had to queue to get in. And not only that, but a library, a Sima hall, which is a monk's ordination hall, a printing press, offices, accommodation, a hospital. 170 acres were requisitioned by the government for this, something like 40 million chats of those times. Sayagyi was on the executive committee, along with U Nu and the finance ministers and others, and the whole thing got built in 13 months. Now just imagine building one of our centers in 13 months compared to this. Sayagyi was also the honorary auditor of the council, which built this. He devised a rather neat little system of donation books of different colors for different sizes donations, one color for 100 chats, one color for 1,000 chats, and so forth. Only selected people were given the higher denominations, and there was never any hint of any embezzlement or misappropriation of funds at all. So that was the Sasana Council. Even after the council had finished, Sayagyi continued on the board, and they continued to publish a monthly magazine, often with one of Lady Sayadaw's discourses in it. You can get those magazines today, or some of them, in Pariyatti. Now, around that time, a rather important student came and took his first course with Sayagyi. And here he is. We all know the story of how Goenka came to take his first course very well, how he wanted to get cured from his migraine, and Sayagyi told him no. And that was a strong decision by Sayagyi, because as soon as Goenka entered the compound at IMC for the first time, Sayagyi could see straight away that here was a person of very strong paramis, someone able to spread Dhamma. But regardless of that, Sayagyi rejected him first time. Maybe we can say the first case of special handling. Later, Goenka hesitated, and then finally he took his course, and this was just about the turning of the Sasana, that 2,500th anniversary. And here is Goenka at the end of the course. It's a little post-course photo. Sayagyi, of course, is in the chair. Goenka standing behind him to his left in Indian gear. Mother Sayama below on the left, sitting there. Mother Sayama was a very developed student of Sayagyi's, and above her, U Tin, her husband. So, Goenkaji's first course. And because of the Sasana Council, a number of Westerners had been coming interested in meditation to Burma. Some of them even went to the council to see what it was like. And they became interested in meditation. And essentially, Sayagyi was the only English-speaking meditation teacher of any note in Rangoon, or maybe even in Burma. So they were basically funneled to him. And even before this Sasana Council, there was an interest. In 1952, he was asked by a group of Americans, an American technical mission in Rangoon, could he please give some talks on Buddhism? And the talks were very successful. There were 3 of them given in a Methodist church. And they were later published in a booklet called What Buddhism Is. You can get it today. Beautiful talks, highly recommended. And these talks, or rather this booklet, found its way into Burmese embassies abroad and into Buddhist societies abroad. So word started spreading that here was someone who could really teach, a remarkable meditation teacher, and interest started coming. One of the very first was a man called Van Amersfoort. He was actually the president of the Dutch Buddhist Association. He was on a trade mission, met with Sayagyi, expressed an interest in sitting a course. He only had 4 days. So Sayagyi said, all right, 4-day course. And he attained high stages even in 4 days. Another lady, and this is not the only Westerners, but just some of them, was a lady called Elizabeth Nottingham. She was a Fulbright scholar, lectured at Harvard University. Again was interested, took a course, and she went home and she gave lectures at Harvard on it, and actually gave a series of radio interviews on New York radio, talking about Burma, and one whole session of her interviews, one whole interview, was devoted to IMC. Now, a friend of hers called Marion Dix heard about this. Marion was a filmmaker from California, and so she decided to go and take a course too. And in a little while, we'll see how her course went, because we'll get some film footage from her. Winston and Jocelyn King, another academic couple. Winston was an academic. Jocelyn King took the meditation actually much more seriously than Winston did 3 courses. She talks about, late in the course, waking up from a horrible dream where she was standing over her own dead, putrefying body. Woke up in total shock. It was about 4 a.m., runs to the pagoda where Sayagyi's sleeping, rushes in, Sayagyi sits up, tells him about this horrible dream she had, and she's so frightened. And Sayagyi just starts laughing. And she says that laugh, she'll never forget it. It suddenly reassured her, brought down all her fears, and she realized, yes, now I can face death myself. So, different techniques for different students. John Coleman, the CIA agent who came, wrote The Quiet Mind, and later became a teacher. And Robert Hoover. Robert Hoover was the rocket scientist, the man who devised the nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles, and stood on his shoulders and shook, as Goenkaji described it. Sayagyi also describes the incident in one of his discourses. He said that a gleam of samadhi came in contact with the huge mass of impurities inside, and that was the reaction. Rather like Goenkaji's image of the housewife throwing cold water on the fire. And he said it lasted for about a day, and then it all disappeared. And later, Robert Hoover became one of his most devoted students and became a teacher himself, Vipassana teacher. Now, IMC also came to the interest of a member of parliament in Britain. His name was Christopher Mayhew, socialist member of parliament, and he got interested, and he decided to do a series with the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, on, it was called Men Seeking God. And basically it was about different religious traditions as he thought of them in the East. And he decided to do one on Sayagyi and on Buddhism in Burma. That was what it was called, Buddhism in Burma. Most of the video is devoted not to Sayagyi but to other things, but there's a very short clip at the end. And Sayagyi takes a rather practical point of view. He's not interested in explaining the theory of Buddhism. He says, well, why don't you come and watch one of my students enter the Nibbanic stage? I mean, what an offer. So Christopher Mayhew says, okay, sure. And here it is.
Monks aren't the only teachers of meditation in Burma. With U Yun here is a layman, a former cabinet minister, U Ba Khin, who acts as spiritual director, or guru, of this modern meditation center. In thousands of lay meditation centers like this, Burmese Buddhists cultivate self-mastery as the key to a deeper spiritual life. U Ba Khin's most proficient pupil is Mr. Venkataraman here. He's preparing to go into a trance known as the trance of cessation. He pays his respects to his guru and sits down and begins to concentrate. He's watched by his guru, and nearby, U Yun, another pupil, begins meditation. In less than a minute, Mr. Venkataraman is in a deep trance. When he is like this, nothing can wake him up except the voice of his guru.
Venkataraman.
Some older monks I met had some reservations about the methods of this center, but no one doubts Mr. Venkataraman's remarkable powers of concentration. Afterwards, he explained to me the experience he had had, and summed it up as follows.
As soon as I rose up, I found my body very light, and also, at the same time, my mind was crystal clear.
I see.
It gave me a mental happiness, peace and happiness, which words could not describe. At any rate, it was immensely pleasing to me.
Do your experiences vary at all? I mean, is it the same every time?
Well, of course, you see, it is the same. But the images, when I go in the slow motion, the pictures, what I see, the vision might vary. But otherwise, it's all the same.
And you value these experiences very highly?
Surely, because it gives me mental peace and happiness.
So that's a good recommendation. Now, in the meantime, Sayagyi was very, very busy, mostly under U Nu's patronage and support, in his government posts. We all know how Goenka talks about at one stage he held 4 different senior posts at the same time. These are them. He also held others at different times. 1948, he had of course been appointed Accountant General, and we know the story of how he reformed the Accountant General's office. 5 years later, he resigned and was immediately reappointed, and he continued right there till he retired. 1956, now this is when the Sasana Council is more or less ending. U Nu taps him on the shoulder and says, hey, what about the commercial audit? Now, the commercial audit was charged with auditing all the Burmese nationalized corporations. Huge amounts of money involved. This was all the nationalized industries. And they had a staff of 50 and 3 trained accountants. And they were dealing with something like 1.5 billion in funds. And he manages to get that office working really efficiently. While he's doing that, another government office comes into light where there are problems, which is the State Agricultural Marketing Board. And therein lies a tale. Burma was an extremely fertile country. It was like the Rice Bowl of Asia. Under the British, the Burmese farmers used to sell their produce, rice and other supplies, to the Indian traders, and the Indian traders would then export and sell them. When the Burmese got independence, they nationalized all that and created this state agricultural marketing board, which was a monopoly buyer of rice and also a monopoly seller outside in the export market. The profit margins were huge, thanks to the Indian traders, so it should have been easy. And yet, year after year, it made a chronic deficit. So U Nu asked Sayagyi to investigate. He set up a special inquiry with Sayagyi as its head. The inquiry found that the marketing board the accounts were 5 years in arrears, massive losses of produce due to poor handling, poor storage, and a great web of corruption. Everyone was on the take, dealing with the traders, dealing with the exporters, and the board was just being bled dry. And in that process, the price of rice had dropped from £60 to £34 over 3 years. So it was really a desperate situation. As a result of Sayagyi's inquiry, another inquiry or commission was set up, and they brought charges. And during a meeting, an annual conference of the board, the police came in and arrested 4 of the board members, including the managing director. The officers were not very happy, and at the same time, U Nu had decided that Sayagyi would now run the board. And so the officers knew what was coming, and they didn't like it one little bit. So they went on strike en masse. All the officers resigned. And so Sayagyi walked into a situation where he had no officers, just clerical staff, and these chronic problems and corruption. U Nu backed Sayagyi to the hilt. He didn't back down. For some weeks, the officers were on strike. Sayagyi didn't back down. He just continued to run it with the clerical staff. And they realized the game was up. They came back for some token penalty. And then Sayagyi started working with them and started having meetings, and he felt that very soon he'd turn the tables. Within 2 years, the board was making record profits and was achieving maximum efficiency in the handling of storing of its grain. And it continued like that with Sayagyi as its head. And then finally, U Nu again tapped him on the shoulder and said, look, we don't have enough accountants in the country. Can you start an institute for training them? So he set that up as well. It was very successful. Many of the teachers had actually taken courses with Sayagyi. There was never any complaint from any student, and they remarked how kind the teachers were. Now, I mentioned earlier Marion Dix, the filmmaker from California, who at this time, this is 1959 now, she came along and did a course with Sayagyi, and here is her account of her course. It's about 5 minutes.
To understand Burma, I needed to understand Buddhism. So I entered a Buddhist retreat where I took a course in meditation. It's rare for a Westerner to do so, and I was the only non-Burman there. The octagonal main building had 8 meditation cells around its circumference. The guru or teacher, U Ba Khin, on the right, welcomed me there with some of his disciples, and like the others, I took up residence there at the center in one of the simple cottages right on the premises. On the board there, in Burmese, with English translation for my benefit, is the schedule we followed daily for 10 days. Classes from 4:30 in the morning until 9 at night. 10.5 hours of concentrated training in meditation techniques daily in periods of from 1.5 to 4.5 hours at a stretch. Entering my cell, I discovered it was small, dark, and quite bare except for a mat on the floor to sit on. First, by concentrating complete attention on the spot beneath the nose where the breath can be felt coming and going. Then, when we could do so for hours at a time, we learned increasingly difficult techniques of concentration, all aimed toward purification through subjugation of every desire, until finally we could attain the trance state demonstrated there, body rigid, breathing barely susceptible, mind in oblivion, from which one emerges feeling indescribably serene, I was to discover. During rest periods between meditation sessions, I get acquainted with my Burmese fellow students in my class. And I found out that even Burmans who were used to sitting on the floor got stiff from the long periods in the meditation cells. We had only one meal a day, vegetarian, no meat at all, which we ate together at 10:30 in the morning. It was an occasion for relaxed, informal discussion with the guru.
Miss Dix, did you enjoy this stay at the Buddhist Meditation Center?
Yes, Jack, it was a wonderful experience. The last day of the course, former students and prominent Burmans from all over the country came to pay homage to the guru. Among them, the first president of Burma, Sao Shui Thaik, a Shan prince, the man in white with glasses seated at the guru's feet. The guru was telling them there about my having successfully completed the course, and later many of them came up to me rather shyly to murmur "Thadu," which means well done.
Just so that you know, Sao Shui Taik, of course, was the first president who came out of alcohol on a Sayagyi course. Tried to bargain, couldn't bargain, and ended up coming out of alcohol. A little later, another time, an occasion for another Sayagyi talk, a delegation came from Israel. And this was as a result of a very close relationship between U Nu and the Israeli Prime Minister of that time, David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion was actually widely read in the Buddha's discourses and other works, in the scriptures, and used to have long correspondence with U Nu about them. They were pen pals, essentially. U Nu was invited to Israel by Ben-Gurion, and here he is. He's riding in a car through Tel Aviv, looking pretty happy, waving to the crowds. And this led to a visit by David Ben-Gurion and his foreign minister. While he was in Burma, he actually took a meditation course at U Nu's house, and the journalists, of course, were very curious about this. In fact, Ben-Gurion took some criticism for this in Israel itself, because they were saying, well, you know, you've gone on a diplomatic mission, and here you are doing a meditation course. What's going on here? But he did it. So the press were interested, and they were directed to Sayagyi because he was English-speaking. He invited them for tea at IMC, gave them a talk. It's available in booklet form now. It's called The Real Values of Buddhist Meditation. And he realized that they weren't interested in the afterlife or anything like that. They were interested in what can you get out of meditation now? What's the benefit now? So he talked about his experiences in detail as a civil servant, the Agricultural Marketing Board, and all those things. It's a wonderful discourse if you want to read it. 65, Sayagyi's getting on now, and he decides that he's going to take a retreat. And he's going to take it with Webu Sayadaw. But he doesn't tell anybody. He doesn't want any fuss. So he just jumps in his car, drives up to Mandalay, calls on his old friend, Ukole, who is Chancellor of Mandalay University. Ukole is astonished to see him and says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "Oh, I'm going to take a meditation course with Webu Sayadaw. Do you want to come too?" So Ukole rushes around, gets his gear together, and they go over to Webu Sayadaw's place. And Webu Sayadaw looks at them and says, "You've come here to do good deeds, have you?" They say, yes, sir, we'd like to ordain and meditate." And he says, "Well, if you're going to ordain, a monk has to follow 227 precepts. Do you know the precepts?" "No, sir." "Well, can you control your bodily actions?" "We can try, sir." can you control your mental actions? We can try, sir. Can you control the actions of speech? We can try, sir. Well, I will give you a technique which will enable you to do that. And he teaches them Anapana. And then he says, well, when you're practicing Anapana, are you controlling your physical actions? Yes, sir. And your actions, your verbal actions? Yes, sir. Mental actions? Yes, sir. He says, all right, you do that all the time. And then he looks at them and says, well, you're both over 50, and you've probably slept every single day of your lives. Now, no sleeping, you do this all night. And they continued like that for 7 or 10 days or whatever it was. And that's a beautiful photo on the right of Webu Sayadaw in front, Sayagyi behind him, and Ukole holding the umbrella at the rear. This is a verse which Sayagyi used to recite. By virtue of this action, may I not come in contact with the ignorant, may I encounter only wise, saintly people until I attain Nibbana. And Goenkaji used to hear Sayagyi reciting this sometimes. One time, Sayagyi came round to Goenkaji's house to visit him. Goenkaji, of course, was a student for quite some time now. And he heard Goenkaji reciting this verse, and he said, oh, no, 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 that's not for you. And then he explained, I am just on the borderline of the old and the new sasana. It hasn't really started yet. I'm just on this borderline, and I have no real time to teach, or not much time, because of all my responsibilities, my civic responsibilities, my service to the state. So I can only take a few students, and Sayagyi had actually made a vow that he would only take students of very high paramis, and of course we've seen that. But there were small courses, sometimes just 2 or 3 students, other times 20 or 30. But for Goenkaji, that wasn't the case. He had to deal with the fools. Maybe that's us. But large numbers. And Goenkaji was in the new era. And of course, all this time, Goenkaji didn't know it, but Sayagyi was training him as a teacher. Goenkaji thought he was just being brought along for translation, but not so. Actually, Sayagyi was training him in all the different responses to the different meditation stages. In 1967, and Sayagyi finally retires from all his duties. Actually, there's only 4 years left in his life now. He had a great wish to return Dhamma to India. And in spite of this vow he had, he really wanted to do this. And at one stage, he had an opportunity. An invitation came from Madras. Would Sayagyi like to go over, along with some of his assistants, and give some Vipassana courses in India? Sayagyi was thrilled. So he goes and he applies for the passport to go out of the country. And at that time, passports were very restricted, and you could only get a passport from the government if you were leaving for urgent medical reasons and could show that you needed treatment, or you were going for a job and had an employment contract, or you were leaving the country permanently. And Sayagyi fitted none of those categories. And so the minister, the immigration minister, just sent word to him via a student of his, look, don't worry about that. Just say anything you like and get some bit of paper to prove it. That's fine, we'll pass it. Not Sayagyi. He said, I will never break my Shila, and I will not go and teach on a false basis. So rather than break up his Shila, he gave up his cherished dream of spreading Dhamma in India. Later, when Goenkaji went, Sayagyi was thrilled. He said, you're not going, I'm going, really. And Goenkaji always felt that. And so the training continued. In 1967, Sayagyi decided to give some campsite courses. Normally he only taught at IMC, but now he goes up to Mandalay and Maimyo, takes Goenkaji, along with Sayama and a few others. And these are rough courses. They're held in dharamsalas, hotels, schools, no Dhamma vibrations at all. And Goenkaji later felt that Sayagyi was deliberately exposing him to the kind of rough vibrations he'd have to deal with in India later. On one of the courses, a whole lot of Indian students there, some partly introduced by Goenka. Sayagyi suddenly says to him, "Oh, they won't understand my Burmese, you give the discourse." And so Goenka is used to public speaking, but here he is giving a discourse on a course in front of his own teacher. And Sayagyi is directing him. He says, "All right, now talk about Anathapindika, now talk about Angulimala, now talk about this." And so Sayagyi guided him in giving his first discourses. Later on, you may have heard the story before, small course at IMC, 3 Indian students. Goenka goes down to be present for Anapana, finds Sayagyi lying down in the central cell. Sayagyi says, "You give Anapana." So Goenka gives Anapana. That's his introduction to Anapana. Later in the course, day 4 comes, and Sayagyi suddenly says, "It's Vipassana time. I'm going to have a rest. You give Vipassana." He gives Vipassana to these 3 Indian students, and one of them suddenly starts shaking violently. Goenka is horrified. He doesn't know what to do. He's disconcerted. What am I going to do now? He thinks, should I rush off and get Sayagyi? And then he realizes, no, his metta is with me. All his vibrations are with me. That gives him strength. He starts sending strong metta himself. The shaking stops. The student settles down. Vipassana goes very well. In 1969, 2 years later, of course, Goenka, he'd already been appointed a teacher. He was appointed a teacher in 1967. He goes to India. And now it's the last few years, or the last period of Sayagyi's life. He's teaching full-time at IMC. He's got time to do that now. And just about a week before he passed away, he's just sitting around at IMC with Syama. And he says to Syama, "I'm thinking of leaving for good." And Syama thinks he's talking about going to India. So she says, "Well, go. We'll look after things here." A few days later, he starts remembering all the people who'd helped him in the past. The elderly man who helped him get to the Methodist college, the teacher who'd helped him to St. Paul's, an old friend whose name he saw in the newspapers, and he starts writing letters to all of them. He's not even sick at this stage, but he suddenly starts doing this. And then a few days later, on the 18th of January, he gets sick. He doesn't take it very seriously, but it suddenly develops. He has to be rushed to hospital. On the 19th, he's dead. The friend he wrote to a day earlier gets the letter, and on the same day in the newspaper, gets the notice of Sayagyi's death. He's shocked. And before he passed away, Sayagyi wrote a letter to his Western students which contained this passage, famous passage. He always used to say, "The time clock of Vipassana has struck for the revival of Buddha Dhamma. He has no doubts whatsoever about the results that will accrue, results that are good, concrete, vivid, personal, here and now, which will stand you in a state of well-being and happiness for the rest of your lives." So that letter went out to all his Western students. And here's a tribute from Dr. Om Prakash. Om Prakash was a senior doctor in Rangoon. He was actually the advisor to the United Nations on medicine in Burma. He was also Sayagyi's personal physician. He remarked how Sayagyi always bore illness so patiently, so well. He was such an intelligent, easy patient. And he also said this about him. Om Prakash, by the way, was also a student of Sayagyi's. Initially he wasn't, he was just a doctor, but he saw Goenkaji's aunt passing away in great pain from cancer. Goenkaji's aunt, the one who brought him up, was actually a good Vipassana student, and Om Prakash was hugely impressed by the fortitude, the equanimity with which she bore the death pains of her cancer. That made him decide to do a course, which he did. He became a very developed student himself and was later made a teacher by Goenkaji and came to India. But he makes this point about Sayagyi. His quality was that whenever he spoke to you, you always felt you were really something special to him, a special person to him. And then you discovered that everybody else at the center felt the same way. So that's Om Prakash. Webu Sayadaw came, he outlived Sayagyi, came to Sayagyi's center sometime afterwards and said this. He was talking to Sayagyi's students. Your Sayagyi never died. He won't die. His teaching lives on, as of course it does. Not like some persons who are as if dead even when they're alive, who are of no use to anybody. So Webu Sayadaw had no doubt about Sayagyi's teaching and its impact. And then finally from Goenka, whenever I give Dhamma to anyone, I feel the presence of my Dhamma Father, his metta vibrations. I'm just his humble representative, assisting to spread Dhamma everywhere in fulfillment of his very wishes. A wonderful tribute from one great teacher to another.